Normally I react to the inflation data on the day, but I was away with my mum on a little trip. We had a lovely time, but that's why I'm 24 hours late to the news. But what a crazy 24 hours it's been. As the headline CPI rate of inflation was announced at 2.3%, rumours started swirling that Rishi Sunak was about to call a general election. David Cameron, who was about to receive the warmest welcome he's had in a while from the people of Albania, stood up a whole country by cancelling his trip last minute, improving foreign relations, I'm sure, and adding further fuel to the rumour fire. And then it happened. A soaking wet Rishi Sunak signalled the start of a summer election, while being drowned out by a song synonymous with the Labour Party in the 90s. The whole thing was about as British as it gets, and so is the humour. Drowning Street, things can only get wetter. I love the British. But why didn't they give the man an umbrella? Or just announce it inside? More to the point, why did Rishi scramble to launch an election yesterday to the surprise of everyone in his party? The only person who was actually ready for this was the protester with the speakers, it seems. Well, the answer lies in this statement.
And this morning we received the welcome news that inflation has returned to normal.
Inflation has returned to normal. Has it? So the headline rate that we all see quoted is CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which fell to 2.3%. This was actually a disappointment. They forecasted it would be 2.1%, but it's still close to the Bank of England's target of 2% inflation. Okay, so great news. Well, there's a few things going on here. Let's look at what's driving the declines in this rate, and also some points in the data that I think show that, this is far from a return to normal. Starting with this table that measures CPI, the measure that Rishi likes to focus on, and the media, we can see that the biggest downward pressures on the overall inflation number continue to be sharp declines in the growth rate of food and energy prices. You can see food inflation now has fallen again, but the quickest way to check this is right here at the bottom, where they look at core CPI. So this is the CPI inflation number once you strip out food, energy and tobacco. This is done because these items tend to be highly volatile. So while CPI overall is at 2.3%, the core component is still at 3.9%, showing us that these declines in food, energy and fags are flattering the overall numbers. We'll come back to these core numbers shortly, but this food and energy point is important. We will all remember that food and energy growth at one point was insane. We saw food inflation in the double digits. The headline overall inflation number we see is a measure calculated over 12 months. They go back 12 months and they add together the monthly inflation numbers, and that gives us the annual figure. It's like a conveyor belt where the number from 12 months ago falls off the end and we replace that with the new number this month. Gary's Economics released a video the other day covering this, which I'm sure many people have watched, but I'll link it below if you like. But the key point is, the high period of inflation that we saw 12 months ago, as that falls off the calculation, the overall number falls because those months fall off the back of the conveyor belt. You can see it here. So this plots monthly inflation numbers. So the individual month's inflation going back 5 years. And of course, we have the really high period here, but we also have very high numbers at the start of 2023. And it's this patch of numbers now that are all falling off the conveyor belt. So the overall number comes down. This is why the year-over-year figures can be a bit misleading, really. And relying on them solely in the headline number of 2.3% and saying, everything is fine now, it's just not that accurate, because the headline number can be flattered by large declines in single components or from this process of the very high periods of inflation falling off the back of the conveyor belt. It's also why the Bank of England are forecasting that the overall inflation number will rise again, which they've been saying for months now. It's not a new forecast. If we come back to this monthly view again, so this is the inflation rate for the specific month, I've also added in here the forecasts. We can see that the forecasted monthly inflation rate is elevated above this period here. So it's the same thing in reverse. As these lower months fall off the conveyor belt, these higher months replace them. If this forecast is accurate, they might not be, the headline inflation number will rise again. To claim inflation has returned to normal is a bit brave when we have a pretty good idea that the number will rise again. I think Rishi is banking on another fall in the headline rate next month through the campaign process and is hoping that the election is all done by the time inflation begins to tick up again. The claim that this is over seems even more brazen or maybe foolish when we look at something that we look at every month on this channel. Say it with me, guys. The core numbers. Instead of looking at core CPI, what we're going to do here is look at core CPIH. The H stands for housing. While Rishi might not feel the need to use his perfectly good house right behind him, I like to look at CPIH as a measure of inflation because most of us do use a home. So to ignore or omit the cost of housing from the inflation figures misses out on probably one of the biggest costs that every single person in the UK feels. This is the same data table we looked at before with CPI, but with the H component in it as well. We can already see the impact housing is having on this here. CPI, the one that Rishi uses, is 2.3%, but CPIH is 3%. If we strip out food and energy just to look at the core numbers like we did before, so we remove the flattering effect of things that have gone crazy in the past that are now falling off the conveyor belt, we see core inflation, including housing costs, is at 4.4%, more than double the Bank of England's target. Not exactly normal, is it? Rishi's speech talks about families feeling the benefit of lower inflation, and while it's true that consumer confidence has returned to the market a bit in the last 30 days, I think CPIH, especially the H, speaks to the reality for most households. This chart, which I feature every month in these videos, is the one that I think best helps us visualise this. It shows the inflation associated with housing. Rents are in yellow, owner-occupier housing costs in purple, and a big factor of those is mortgage interest rates. Notice how all costs associated with a home are increasing and continue to increase. The only cost in a home that is actually coming down at the minute is household energy prices in blue here. But again, household energy prices went so high. My household energy bill went from £100 a month to £400 a month. Nothing to do with the fact that I'm running an illegal sunbed shop operation out my shed, I'm sure. But yeah, so prices are falling now, yes, but energy's still expensive. My household energy bill going from £400 to £200 is a large drop in the price of household energy, but it's still double what I paid prior to all of this. So your house today, your rent or your mortgage, whatever, is more expensive to run than it was just a couple of years ago. And you can see it right here. The headline rate of inflation falls due to the conveyor belt effect we discussed, but the costs associated with owning a home are climbing now at the fastest rate since 1992. The biggest relief to this growth will be when rates are cut. That was expected to be in June, but the hopes of that have softened now as the CPI rate didn't come down as much as they'd hoped, but mainly because, as has been the case now for 2 years, we've been going on about this, the service-based inflation numbers are just not moving. We're still in the CPIH table here. Service-based inflation is locked at 6%. The UK is a service-based economy. We sell, buy, consume, and in the main work in service-based jobs. Think finance and banking over manufacturing as an example. So service-based inflation speaks to the inflation in the UK. It tells us what's going on under the hood, if you will. When all the quick wins and conveyor belt effects have fallen away, it's kind of what we're left with. With the price of services we use every day going up by 6% a year, will the people of the UK honestly say, yes, this is all fine? Remember, inflation compounds, so the 6% service inflation this year is on top of the service-based inflation we saw in previous years. It's like investments, but compounding in reverse. If fuel and energy in the main is influenced by external factors like wars or COVID, it's this service-based inflation that I would argue in our service-based economy is the main mandate of the Bank of England to control. And currently, the actions of the bank through the rising of interest rates that takes money out of the pockets of the UK public through making servicing debts like mortgages more expensive and reducing their spending power has done little to relieve this sticky inflation. Interest rates are a blunt tool and the effects of rising rates takes time to feed into the economy. But I can't see how the Bank of England can think that they've fixed the problem until these service numbers start dropping at least a little bit. But hey, you don't need to worry about all of that, because we're about to be exposed to weeks of the Conservative government saying they fixed the problem while the Labour government blamed them for causing the problem in the first place. A back and forwards blame game aimed at winning votes, with everyone focused on the past and no one saying what the future holds for any of us with any form of clarity or certainty. I'm often criticised for being too left on the channel, saying I clearly hate the Conservatives. I don't. I just hate blatant incompetence and misleading lies. I will criticise Labour just as hard if they come in and make decisions that I think are bad for the population of the UK financially. For Rishi to say his government fixed the inflation problem is a joke at best. What's actually happened here is Rishi has spotted a small window of opportunity where he thinks for the next 7 weeks inflation will be near the 2% Bank of England target, so he can just parade around and say, look, I did this, just before the numbers creep back up again probably. As the Bank of England themselves, the body that is actually the one influencing this, has forecasted for months. If things could only get better, Rishi would wait to start the election. He just knows for now that this is probably as good as it gets.